Imagine water. Not the azure, sparkling, safe expanse of a luxury cruise brochure. Imagine instead a black, icy, oily substance, a hostile medium weighing a metric ton for every cubic meter. An environment where human life is an anomaly, trespassing in a realm not meant for it. A place where lungs fill with saline fluid in 40 seconds and hypothermia stills the heart in 15 minutes. The ocean is no friend. It is a gargantuan, indifferent predator that knows how to wait. We all know the story of the Titanic. It is the 20th century's most promoted brand of catastrophe. We have memorized the elegant legend of the iceberg, the noble orchestra playing hymns to the very last second, the gentlemen in tuxedos yielding their places in the lifeboats. We have romanticized this tragedy, spun it into a Hollywood fairy tale of love, hubris, and fate. But what if the Titanic is a gentle, almost sterile version of maritime horror? What if, in the true hierarchy of nightmares, its story does not even rank among the 5 deadliest shipwrecks in history? History is a professional liar. It is a virtuoso at concealing the dead, especially when those dead are inconvenient. To politicians, to admirals, to insurance corporations, or to the delicate construct of national pride. There are disasters against which the loss of the Wibbert in the thousands and tens of thousands, where the dying were not millionaires with cigars, but refugees, wounded soldiers, prisoners of war, and children. Entire floating cities vanishing into the abyss in less time than it takes to smoke a single cigarette. We will unseal the secret archives of the Admiralty and the Kriegsmarine, the protocols of coast guards from the United States to the Philippines. We will raise files that for decades bore the stamp of top secret, or worse, to be forgotten forever. We will travel to the frozen Baltic of 1945, where the sea ran red with blood. We will witness a tropical paradise transform into a fiery trap patrolled by sharks. We will investigate a nuclear event that occurred before the invention of the atomic bomb. This is an investigation into how humanity learned to forget its most terrible mistakes. We are descending to a depth where the real, uninvented ghosts of the ocean lie. Our journey begins at a point in time and space where the Second World War had reached its apex of cruelty, chaos, and desperation. January 1945. Eastern Prussia, the port of Gotenhafen. A vast and relentless machine of vengeance, the Soviet army is closing in from the east. The Eastern Front is not merely bending, it is shattering. A tide of humanity, millions of German civilians, washes west. They are fleeing a terror born of propaganda, but also a terror made real by the brutal machinery of a war they are now losing. They are caught in a closing steel vice, squeezed between the grinding treads of advancing Soviet tanks and the unforgiving, ice-choked waters of the Baltic Sea. There is only one path, one desperate final artery of escape: the water. In the chaos, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz unleashes Operation Hannibal, the largest, most desperate maritime evacuation in the annals of human history. The objective? To ferry more than 2 million souls to safety, a colossal undertaking shadowed by the constant threat of Soviet submarines, torpedo bombers, and vast, unseen minefields. In the port of Gotenhafen, lashed to the Okshaft pier, a giant waits. A ship that was once meant to be a symbol of Nazi prosperity is about to become a floating tomb. The Wilhelm Gustloff. 208 meters of steel, displacing 25,000 tons. In another lifetime, she was a vision in white, the flagship of the Nazi Strength Through Joy program, a vessel built not for war, but for propaganda. A classless utopia at sea, with swimming pools, cinemas, and sun-drenched decks for the loyal workers of the Reich. Now, that gleaming white has been painted over with the grim, camouflaged grey of war. She is a floating barracks, a depot ship for the 2nd Submarine Training Division. Her official papers, the strict regulations of maritime safety, state she is designed for a maximum of 1,800 passengers. But in the frozen pandemonium of January 1945, paper means nothing. The scene on the pier is a portrait of madness. Hysterical crowds storm the gangways. Mothers, their faces etched with desperation, pass their children over the heads of the throng, pleading with officers to take them, even if they themselves are left behind. Wounded soldiers, pale and silent on stretchers, are carried aboard and laid in rows upon any available surface, the floors of corridors, the gilded dining rooms, the winter garden, and even the cold, tiled basin of the drained swimming pool. The official ship's manifest stops counting at 6,000 souls. Yet forensic analysis and historical records, pieced together decades later, tell a far more staggering story. On board the Wilhelm Gustloff were more than 10,500 people. The entire population of a small city packed into a single steel hull. More than 4 times the number of souls aboard the Titanic. And the lifeboats, the rafts, all the means of survival were sufficient for barely a third of them, even if packed to the breaking point. But the true foundation for the coming catastrophe is being laid on the ship's bridge. Here, command is fractured. Not 1, but 4 captains stand at the helm. A military commandant, the ship's aging civilian captain, Friedrich Petersen, and 2 younger officers from the merchant marine. A fatal division of authority. A conflict ignites between them, an argument that will seal the fate of thousands. The military man, Korvettenkapitän Wilhelm Zahn, speaks the brutal language of survival in a war zone. He demands maximum speed and evasive anti-submarine zigzag maneuvers. It is the textbook, the only way to outrun a predator. But another voice, weary with age and the immense weight of his cargo, belongs to Captain Petersen. He argues for caution. The ship is dangerously overloaded. The engines, dormant for years, are strained and unreliable. They cannot endure the race. Furthermore, he fears the coastal shallows are sown with mines. Petersen overrules the military man, ordering a straight course through a deep water channel. It is a decision that turns the liner into a predictable, perfect target. And then an error is made. An inexplicable, almost unbelievable mistake that defies all military and maritime logic, compounding one fatal decision with another. A choice that would light a beacon in the dark, guiding death directly to their door. The 30th of January, 1945. A date of malignant symbolism. It marked the anniversary of Hitler's ascent to power and what would have been the 50th birthday of the man for whom the ship was named, Wilhelm Gustloff. Out on the Baltic, the night is absolute. A blizzard rages. The air temperature has plunged to -18 degrees Celsius. The water, a mere 2 degrees above freezing. A malevolent wind shrieks, ripping frozen spray from the black crests of the waves. Through this chaos, the liner pushes forward, a ghost ship shrouded in total darkness. Deep within its hull, a radio operator receives an encrypted message. A convoy of German minesweepers is approaching on a reciprocal course. To avoid a catastrophic collision in the storm and the dark, Captain Friedrich Petersen makes a decision. He gives the order to activate the ship's navigation lights. Consider the gravity of this command. In an active war zone, in waters infested with Soviet submarines, a colossal liner, 900 feet in length, is set ablaze with light. For 90 agonizing minutes, the Wilhelm Gustloff transforms into a luminous spectacle, a festive beacon in the heart of a black, murderous desert. It is no longer a ship, it is an invitation. It screams to the world, "I am here, come and kill me." At that very moment, only a few miles away, a periscope slices through a wave. It belongs to the Soviet submarine S-13. Her commander is Alexander Marinesko, a man of complex destiny. To his own superiors, he was a hooligan, a discipline problem. To his enemies, he would become known as a devil, the Führer's personal nemesis. He was a man on the edge, sailing under the shadow of a court-martial for his transgressions ashore. He needed a victory. He needed redemption. And fate, in its inscrutable way, had just delivered him the largest target in the entire Baltic Sea. Marinesko cannot believe his eyes. An enormous transport, glowing with light, is steaming directly towards him. He begins a maneuver of breathtaking audacity. The S-13 will not attack from the deep sea, where an assault is expected. Instead, he swings the submarine in towards the coast, into the treacherous shallows. It is a mortal risk. The boat could run aground, be shattered on hidden rocks, or be spotted by coastal batteries. But Marinesko understands the psychology of his enemy. The Germans are watching the sea, the abyss. They are not watching the shore. At 9:04, the command rings out. Fire! 4 torpedoes are launched from the bow tubes. On the casing of each, the Soviet sailors have painted a message in crude, stark lettering. This is not merely a strike. It is a settling of accounts. The first, for the motherland. The second, for the Soviet people. The third, for Leningrad. The fourth, for Stalin. The final torpedo, the one bearing the dictator's name, jams in its tube. It is a critical failure, a live warhead threatening to detonate and obliterate the submarine from within. But with a mixture of terror and expertise, the crew miraculously manages to disarm it. 3 instruments of vengeance race toward their target. The flight time is less than 1 minute. The first explosion. The torpedo for the motherland strikes the bow. This is where the ship's off-duty crew and the U-boat trainees were quartered. The concussive force annihilates the ship's control systems and kills, in an instant, the very men who might have organized an orderly evacuation. The ship is now a blind, dying beast. The second explosion, for the Soviet people. It finds the ship's most vulnerable, most tragic location, the drained swimming pool on E-deck. It was here, in the tiled basin, that the women of the Naval Auxiliary Corps, the Kriegsmarine Helferinnen, girls between the ages of 17 and 25, had been billeted. The blast atomizes tile, glass, mosaic, and steel, turning the enclosed space into a vortex of shrapnel. The sea erupts through the ruptured hull, the immense volume of the pool filling in a matter of seconds with a maelstrom of freezing water and death. In the unforgiving arithmetic of war, a single command, a desperate gamble, and a thirst for revenge converged in the dark. The sea, indifferent and eternal, would soon claim the rest, bearing silent witness to an agony born from the intersection of human fallibility and the relentless machinery of hatred. The blast tore them apart. Those it did not kill with fire and shrapnel, it gave to the black, freezing water. In the ship's swimming pool, a moment of fleeting warmth became a tomb. For the young women of the Naval Auxiliary Corps swimming there was no escape. They were either atomized by the explosion or instantly drowned in the glacial torrent that replaced the pool's placid water. There were no chances of survival. Not here. Not on this night. A second torpedo, and then a third. Deep within the vessel's iron heart, the torpedoes struck the engine compartments. The lights, 1,000 points of defiant life against the Baltic night, flickered and died. The thrumming pulse of the engines fell silent. The great ship, a city of souls adrift, lost all power, all light, all heat. And then came the panic, a primal terror for which the infamous events aboard the Titanic were but an orderly drill. The Titanic had taken 2 hours and 40 minutes to founder, granting a desperate, fleeting window for order and escape. The Wilhelm Gustloff would be dragged to the bottom in just 40 minutes. Imagine the scene. Narrow, claustrophobic corridors, choked with thousands of people, all bundled in heavy winter clothing. Absolute darkness, punctuated only by the rising crescendo of screams. The vessel begins a sickening, inexorable list to its port side. The decks, already slick with a sheath of ice, now tilt at an impossible angle. People lose their footing, sliding down the frozen inclines, becoming a human avalanche that crushes those below, shattering limbs and extinguishing lives in a cascade of brute force. The system of watertight bulkheads, once the pride of German engineering, a guarantee of safety, now became a fatal trap. In a desperate bid to preserve the ship's buoyancy, the captain gave the order to seal the lower compartments. But in doing so, he entombed thousands of men, women, and children who had been quartered in the converted lower holds. They could hear the water rising outside the armored steel doors. They could feel the ship lurching towards its end. They hammered on the unyielding steel, their cries for help absorbed by the groaning hull. No one came. They were buried alive in a cold, dark coffin of German steel. For those who fought their way out of the suffocating corridors, the upper decks offered not salvation, but a new circle of hell. The lifeboat davits, the mechanisms of rescue, were frozen solid. A thick layer of ice, several centimeters deep, encased every moving part, rendering them useless. The mechanisms were jammed. Launching the boats was impossible. In a frenzy, men took axes to the thick ropes, hoping to hack the boats free. Officers fired their pistols into the air, a futile attempt to impose order on pure chaos. And then, seeing the hopelessness of it all, some turned those same weapons on their own families, and finally, on themselves, choosing a swift end over the agonizing death the sea promised. The most terrible enemy was not the sinking ship, nor the ocean itself. It was the cold. The water temperature was a mere 2 degrees above freezing. In such conditions, the human body surrenders with terrifying speed. Pain shock arrives in under a minute, cardiac arrest, and death in 15. And the children? On board were nearly 5,000 children. For them, the instruments of salvation became tools of execution. The standard-issue life vests, designed for adults, were far too large. Upon hitting the water, the rigid cork buoyancy of the vest would be forced upwards by the impact, snapping the small neck of the child or flipping them over, holding their face beneath the surface. The rescuers who arrived later would speak of the sight that haunted them forever: a vast, dark expanse of water from which protruded thousands of tiny, motionless legs. When the escort vessel, the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, steamed past, its captain too fearful of lurking Soviet submarines to stop, only a single small torpedo boat, the Löwe, braved the danger to approach the site of the sinking. Its crew looked out upon a scene from a nightmare. The sea was not water, but a vast, undulating carpet of frozen bodies. Of the more than 10,500 souls aboard, only some 1,200 were pulled from the water alive. Over 9,000 perished. A loss of life equivalent to 6 Titanics. The population of an entire town erased from existence in less than an hour. Why then is this colossal tragedy a footnote in history? Because it was a casualty of a war that had no room for such grief. Hitler forbade any official announcement of the sinking, any period of mourning, fearing it would shatter the nation's morale. The Allies remained silent, for the sinking of a ship crowded with refugees, even one carrying military personnel and armed with anti-aircraft guns, making it a legitimate target, was an uncomfortable, dirty truth. And so, the Wilhelm Gustloff became a ghost, its story submerged along with its hull. Today, its wreckage lies on the floor of the Baltic, a designated war grave. Divers are forbidden to approach. It remains a sealed tomb, a silent testament to the countless stories the sea keeps, and to the inconvenient dead of a war that chose which of its victims were worthy of remembrance. Illicit footage, captured in the deep, reveals the steel carcass twisted into 3 distinct sections. The hull, crumpled as if by a titan's hand, resembles a common tin can. It is a monument to human madness, an abyssal testament to the price of war. But we journey now from the frozen stillness of the Baltic to the sweltering, humid tropics. The Philippine archipelago, the 20th of December, 1987. If the wreck in the north was a tragedy of war, an inevitable sacrifice to the maw of history, then the fate of the ferry Doña Paz was something else entirely. It was a testament to pure, unalloyed human avarice, to corruption, and to a negligence so profound it borders on malice. She was the Doña Paz, an old Japanese ferry built in the 1960s, a vessel long past its prime. Decommissioned, sold off, and given a second life in the Philippines, a rusted hull plying the waters between the islands of Leyte and Luzon. It was the eve of Christmas, the most vibrant, most chaotic, most hopeful time of the year. The ports were a tide of humanity. People were traveling to Manila to be with their families, their arms laden with gifts, with sacks of rice, with live chickens clutched for the holiday feast. The ferry's official capacity was 1,518 souls. But in the Philippines of the 1980s, during the Christmas rush, official counts were a fiction. The captain and the company that owned the ship took on anyone who could pay in cash, the money slipping past the books and into private pockets. The ship swelled with life. Corridors became dormitories, stairwells became makeshift beds. People slept in the cargo holds and on the open decks, exposed to the night air. 3, sometimes 4 people crammed into a single narrow bunk. Children, small and trusting, curled up to sleep on hard-sided suitcases. The ferry was so overloaded that its waterline sank to a critically low level. A later investigation would reveal the chilling truth. On board that night were more than 4,000 people, overloaded by a factor of 3. The night is deep. The tabla straight, a mirror of black glass. There is no moon, but visibility is clear. On the captain's bridge of the Doña Paz, there is an unnerving silence. No one is there. Captain Eusebio Nazareno is in his cabin, watching a film, drinking beer with his officers. On watch, a single trainee, himself not entirely sober, is left in nominal command. The radio is silent. The navigation lights are dark. A desperate attempt to save electricity, or perhaps a simple failure left unrepaired. And out of the gloom, another phantom emerges, sailing toward them. The oil tanker, Vector. It too is a vessel of gross violations, operating without a license, without a qualified captain, without a lookout. And it is carrying the most dangerous cargo in the world. 8,800 barrels, more than 1 million liters, of gasoline, kerosene, and diesel fuel. 2 ghost ships, one packed with human life, the other a floating bomb, sailed toward one another in the crushing, absolute dark. 10:30 in the evening. The impact. This was no cinematic grinding of steel, no slow, protracted agony of a vessel meeting its end. This was the detonation of a napalm bomb. The Vector tore into the side of the ferry. A single spark from the screeching metal was all it took. 1 million liters of fuel detonated. The tanker erupted instantly, but the true nightmare had just begun. Its cargo, a river of liquid fire, poured out across the water's surface. This is the horror that sets this catastrophe apart from all others. The Doña Paz was not merely sinking, she was burning. And the very sea that should have offered salvation was now a part of the inferno. Passengers, driven from the suffocating heat of the cabins, ran onto the decks, only to be met by a solid wall of flame. There was nowhere to jump. The water had become a boiling cauldron, a flaming pyre. Those who took the desperate plunge were incinerated on contact. Those who remained aboard were left to suffocate on toxic black smoke, to be consumed by a heat so intense it melted steel. There was no escape. There was only panic, absolute and all-consuming. This was not a battle against the indifferent forces of nature, nor the tragic consequence of war. It was a catastrophe built piece by piece, decision by decision, from the simple, terrible materials of human greed and indifference. A fire on the water, ignited long before the first spark ever flew. The lockers, the small sanctuaries meant to hold life vests, had been sealed shut, padlocked. The crew, in a grim calculus of mistrust, had feared their passengers would steal them. Enter. There was no time to launch the lifeboats. Their mechanisms had either seized from the intense heat or had simply burned away into uselessness. The accounts of the few who survived paint a picture of a world turned inside out, of horrors for which the human mind has no preparation. The water around the ship was boiling. One witness saw human beings, neighbors from the deck below, become charred in seconds. their bodies twisting into blackened statues. He heard the screams of thousands of people, a sound so immense, so unified in its agony that it became a single, continuous wail, a sound that rose above the roar of the fire itself. And then another factor emerged from the depths: sharks. The Tablas Strait, the very water into which they had plunged, is infamous for its dense populations of tiger and bull sharks. Drawn by the scent of blood, by the stench of burning fuel and flesh, by the violent vibrations of a dying ship, the predators arrived for a feast. For the few who managed to swim clear of the inferno, a second, more primal terror awaited in the dark water below. They had escaped the fire only to meet the jaws. The ferry, the Doña Paz, sank in 2 hours. The oil tanker it had struck, the Vector, took 4. Yet the Coast Guard would not learn of the catastrophe for another 8 hours. No one had sent a distress signal. Of the 4,386 souls aboard, only 24 passengers from the ferry and 2 crewmen from the tanker would see the dawn. 26 people. A mortality rate of 99.4%. The world registered the shock for precisely 1 week, and then it forgot. The reasons are as cold and deep as the sea itself. It was a ferry of the developing world. There were no Americans, no Europeans among the dead to anchor the story in the Western news cycle. The bodies, those that weren't consumed by predators, were incinerated, leaving no one to bury, no funerals to televise. Today, at the site where the Doña Paz went down, divers sometimes discover strange, fused conglomerates on the seabed, unholy amalgamations of melted steel and human bone. And everywhere, scattered across the ocean floor, are thousands of pairs of shoes, untouched by the fire, preserved by the water, a silent testament to the vanished feet that once wore them. But the sea holds other, older memories of ships that brought not just passage, but annihilation. We travel back now to the First World War, to the Canadian city of Halifax. The date is the 6th of December, 1917. This is not the story of a passenger vessel's doom, but of the near total destruction of an entire city. It is the story of how a single ship became a weapon of mass destruction. Into the harbor of Halifax steams a French cargo vessel, the SS Mont Blanc. To any observer on the shore, she is unremarkable. A common, rust-streaked tramp steamer going about its wartime business. But her holds are packed with a cargo of concentrated death. She is ferrying munitions from New York to France, a floating arsenal of unimaginable power. On board are 2,300 tons of picric acid, an explosive significantly more volatile than TNT. 200 tons of TNT itself, 10 tons of gun cotton, and lashed directly to the deck, exposed to the open air, are barrels of high-octane benzol fuel. In effect, the Mont Blanc is a floating atomic bomb in a pre-nuclear age. In the narrow channel known as the Narrows, the Mont Blanc encounters a Norwegian vessel, the SS Imo. In a fatal ballet of miscalculation, poor communication, and the stubborn pride of 2 captains, the ships collide. The impact itself was not severe, a glancing blow, but it was enough. It ruptured the benzol barrels on the Mont Blanc's deck. The fuel poured across the hot steel, and sparks from the grinding metal ignited the fumes. a fire began. The captain and crew of the Mont Blanc, knowing with absolute certainty the apocalyptic nature of the cargo beneath their feet, wasted no time. They scrambled into their lifeboats and rowed for the shore with the strength of pure terror, screaming warnings to the city and to the other sailors in the harbor. "Run! Explosives!" But they were shouting in French. In the English-speaking port of Halifax, their desperate cries were just noise, lost in the wind. The city, meanwhile, began to gather. From their homes, from their workplaces, from the schools, the people of Halifax came out to watch the burning ship. It was a spectacle, a grand, dramatic fire on the water. They were watching the final moments of their world. A burning ship, a pyre adrift, drifted toward the piers. From the windows of homes, schools, and factories, the people of Halifax watched. On the hills overlooking the harbor, school children pointed, their lessons forgotten. In the port itself, dock workers paused for a smoke, their eyes fixed on the spectacle. Thousands of gazes, drawn to a pillar of fire and smoke, a burning fuse inching its way toward the city's heart. At 9:04 on the morning of December the 6th, 1917, the fuse reached its end. The French cargo ship, the SS Mont Blanc, detonated. It was, until the advent of nuclear weaponry, the most powerful man-made explosion in human history. A force equivalent to nearly 3,000 tons of trinitrotoluene, 1/5 the terrifying power that would one day be unleashed upon Hiroshima. In that fraction of a second, the ship did not sink. It was atomized, utterly erased from existence. Its 90mm forward cannon was found more than 5 kilometers from the port. A half-ton anchor shank was hurled across the city, landing in a forest nearly 4 kilometers away. The water of the harbor was flash-boiled into steam, exposing the seabed for one horrifying instant. Then it returned, not as a tide, but as a monster. A tsunami, 18 meters high, crashed over the ruins, sweeping away the dazed and the wounded, scouring the wreckage clean. The blast wave had already moved on, moving faster than sound, an invisible wall of pure force. It struck the district of Richmond and wiped it from the face of the earth. Entire homes disintegrated into splinters. But the most intimate horror was reserved for those who watched. The pressure wave shattered glass across the entire city. For every person pressed against a window, that pane of glass became a claymore mine. Shards, propelled at the speed of a bullet, flew inward. 1,000 people were blinded, removing what was left of their patients' eyes. Halifax became the city of the blind. Nearly 2,000 souls were extinguished in that moment. 9,000 more suffered grievous injury. And as if to seal the city in its misery, the next day a blizzard began, burying the survivors in the frozen ruins of their homes. Decades later, the physicist Robert Oppenheimer would study the data from the Halifax event, calculating the terrible mathematics of the first atomic bomb. The Canadian port city had become an unwitting laboratory, a real-world model for a nuclear apocalypse. But the architecture of catastrophe is not always built from high explosives. Sometimes its foundations are laid by quiet greed on the dark waters of a river. The United States of America, April 1865. The Civil War had just bled its last. Abraham Lincoln was dead. The nation was a fractured thing, shrouded in mourning and chaos. From the squalor of Confederate prison camps, thousands of Union soldiers, newly liberated, yearned only for home, for the North. They were specters of men, emaciated by starvation, ravaged by dysentery and scurvy, living skeletons in tattered blue uniforms. In Vicksburg, Mississippi, a wooden paddle steamer named the Sultana waited at the dock. Her legal capacity was 376 passengers and crew, but the government, desperate to move its soldiers, was paying a bounty: $5 for every enlisted man, 10 for an officer. They were enormous sums. For the Sultana's captain, J. Cass Mason, the mathematics of avarice silenced the voice of reason. He bribed the quartermasters, and he gave the order to load the men, then more, and more again. 2,427 people were crammed aboard the vessel. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a dense mass of humanity. The decks groaned and sagged so severely under the weight they had to be shored up with heavy wooden beams. To prevent the top-heavy ship from capsizing, the soldiers were given a stark command: do not move. But the greatest danger was not the human cargo, it was in the heart of the ship. One of the 4 massive steam boilers had sprung a leak. The chief engineer warned Captain Mason directly. A proper repair, a replacement of the iron sheeting, would take 3 days. 3 days Mason did not have. Other steamers would take his soldiers and his money. He gave his own order. "Put a patch on it," he commanded. A simple piece of iron riveted over the rupture, a flimsy metal bandage on a mortal wound. They would make it, somehow. At 2 o'clock in the morning on April the 27th, the Sultana churned its way north against the powerful current of the Mississippi River, its decks packed with sleeping men dreaming of home. It was a floating coffin, its fate already sealed, steaming silently into the darkness. It is a testament to a terrible truth, that the most devastating explosions are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are the silent, internal detonations of human judgment which precede the fire and the ruin to come. The Mississippi River, swollen with the spring thaw, fights against the hull. It is a torrent of mud and uprooted trees, a hostile force of nature. On the decks of the steamboat Sultana, more than 2,000 men sleep, dreaming of home. They are the survivors of Andersonville and Cahaba, skeletal figures who have endured the worst of the American Civil War. Their ordeal, they believe, is over. But deep within the ship, a different war is being waged. The boilers, patched and failing, are pushed far beyond their limits. The captain, paid by the head for every soldier he transports, has dangerously overloaded his vessel. The boat groans, listing heavily in the powerful current. Inside the iron heart of the engine room, the water sloshes violently, exposing the red-hot metal walls of the boilers. For a moment, they glow, unprotected. Then, another wave of water crashes against them. The result is instantaneous, a catastrophic transformation of liquid into gas, a pressure spike beyond all measure. In the dark of the early morning, 3 of the 4 boilers detonate as one. It is not an explosion, it is an eruption. A volcano of searing steam and shrapnel erupting from within the wooden ship. The force is unimaginable. The upper decks, crowded with hundreds of sleeping soldiers, are blasted into the sky, a geyser of timber and human bodies. Men are torn to splinters or thrown directly into the exposed, fiery furnace of the engine room. Superheated steam, an invisible, scorching cloud, freezing water of the Mississippi. The river here is 5 kilometers wide, its current swift and unforgiving. The men are emaciated, weakened by months of starvation in prison camps. Many are wounded, many cannot swim. The burning husk of the Sultana drifts downstream, a floating pyre that illuminates a scene from hell. In the flickering firelight, men cling to debris, to the thrashing bodies of cavalry horses that were also aboard, even to each other, their panic dragging comrades to the bottom. On the distant shores, residents hear the screams and can do nothing. The scale of the horror is simply too vast. By dawn, nearly 1,800 souls are lost. It is a death toll that eclipses even that of the charter Frey the story is buried. For on the previous day, John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Abraham Lincoln, had been cornered and killed. The hunt that had captivated a grieving nation was over. The deaths of 1,800 war heroes, men who had survived the nation's bloodiest conflict, simply did not fit the narrative. They died from a captain's greed and a failing boiler, only to be forgotten by the morning news. Today, the wreckage of the Sultana does not lie at the bottom of the river. The Mississippi, in its relentless power, has long since changed its course. The ship's remains and the bones of those trapped within are buried under 10 meters of silt and earth beneath a quiet soybean field in Arkansas. A forgotten tomb over which farmers still plow the soil. This silence, the kind that swallows whole tragedies, echoes through history. On the 17th of June, 1940, France has fallen. The evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force is a desperate scramble, not just from Dunkirk, but from every possible port. At Saint-Nazaire, the liner HMT Lancastria becomes a vessel of last resort, taking on soldiers, civilians, and refugees. Built to hold 3,000, it is swarmed by somewhere between 6,000 and 9,000 desperate people. As it sits in the estuary, a German bomber appears overhead. A single bomb falls, perfectly, horrifically, down the ship's wide funnel and into its engine room. The liner is disemboweled. It sinks in just tin to the sea, creating a thick, black shroud around the dying vessel. As survivors struggle in the slick, German aircraft descend, strafing the helpless men and women with machine guns and dropping incendiary bombs. The oil ignites. The sea itself becomes a burning trap. The loss of life is staggering. Between 4,000 and 7,000 people perish. It remains the single greatest maritime disaster in British history. Yet the next day, the newspapers are silent. Winston Churchill, fearing the catastrophic blow to national morale, imposes a D notice, a state-enforced blackout of the news. The story is officially suppressed. Two colossal tragedies, separated by an ocean and nearly a century. One erased by the shadow of a more prominent headline, the other by the deliberate hand of the state. They serve as a chilling testament that the measure of a catastrophe is not only in the lives it claims, but in the memory it is denied. For some histories are not written in headlines, but are buried in the earth and drowned in a sea of official silence. At the height of the Second World War, a directive came from the highest level of the British government. Winston Churchill himself imposed a D notice, an absolute prohibition on publication. The press, he argued, was already saturated with grim tidings. "We must not," he declared, "break the spirit of the nation." And so, the families of the dead were never told how their loved ones truly perished. They received sterile telegrams of regret, their grief shrouded in the necessary fog of war. The truth was deemed too corrosive, too terrible for public consumption. It was buried under state secrecy, a classified sorrow that would not see the light of day for 50 years. Only at the close of the 20th century would the children and grandchildren of the lost finally learn the true, horrific fate of their forebears. It begs a fundamental question of our collective memory. Why does one name, Titanic, echo through eternity as the paragon of maritime disaster, a legend enshrined in film and folklore? And why are the names Wilhelm Gustloff, Dona Paz, Mont Blanc, and Sultana relegated to the shadows, mere ghosts in the footnotes of encyclopedias? The answer is as cynical as it is simple. It lies in the psychology of the masses and the stories we choose to tell ourselves. The Titanic is high drama. It is a morality play staged on a tilting deck, a grand narrative of hubris punished by nature. It is a story of stark class inequality, of a slow, almost theatrical descent into the abyss that afforded its players time. Time for heroism, time for last words, for prayers, for romance. It was a beautiful tragedy, made all the more compelling because its victims included the wealthy, the famous, the titans of their age. Its demise was majestic, a symphony of splintering steel and soaring violins. The catastrophes we have forgotten were not dramas. They were abattoirs. There was no orchestra on the deck of the Wilhelm Gustloff. There was only the percussive chaos of Soviet torpedoes striking a ship packed with 10,000 refugees, mostly women and children. There was the desperate, futile stampede in frozen corridors, the sound of children's screams being swallowed by the black, indifferent waters of the Baltic. There was the stench of vomit and the ice-slicked decks, a vision of hell in the dead of a winter night. On the Dona Paz, nobility was incinerated in an instant. There was no dignified acceptance of fate, only a floating inferno of gasoline and oil. The air filled not with prayer, but with the horrifying scent of burning fuel and human flesh. A nightmare punctuated by the arrival of sharks, drawn to the carnage in the Tabla Strait. The passengers of the Sultana, mostly Union soldiers returning from Confederate prison camps, were granted no time for farewells. There was only the scalding, apocalyptic shriek of a boiler explosion, a blast that tore the heart from the vessel and turned the Mississippi River into a cauldron of steam, splintered wood, and human agony. And in Halifax, the final moments of the Mont Blanc were not a sinking, but a vaporization. The munitions ship's end was a concussion that flattened a city, leaving behind a population of the blind, their eyes pierced by a million shards of flying glass. These tragedies are too terrible, too swift, too squalid, and too politically inconvenient to be spun into a beautiful legend. They do not sell cinema tickets. They inspire only visceral horror and profound sadness. They are mirrors, reflecting not the caprice of nature, but the failures of man. For this is the true face of a man-made catastrophe. It is not a fated iceberg emerging from the mist. It is war, an enterprise that renders human life cheaper than a cartridge. It is the insatiable greed of corporations and captains who cram humor drinking beer in the mess when they should be watching the radar. Yet from these unmarked graves, a strange and vital legacy emerges. Science studies these events not for the sake of history, but to understand the breaking point, not of metal, but of human systems. The horrifying loss of the Wilhelm Gustloff fundamentally changed the rules of maritime evacuation and the very design of life rafts. The self-inflating, canopied models we have today are a direct response to the thousands who froze to death in the Baltic. The agony of the Deadlier Pass forced a complete overhaul of the maritime code throughout Southeast Asia. The explosion of the Sultana gave birth to a state system of technical oversight for steam boilers, a bureaucracy of safety that has since saved countless thousands of lives. The blast in Halifax taught the world the nascent sciences of disaster medicine and the mass treatment of ocular injuries. The dead from these forgotten calamities became the silent architects of our own safety. We owe our lives to ghosts whose names we will never know. The ocean is not merely water, it is a giant, cold archive. At the bottom of the Baltic lies the rusting, fractured hull of the Wilhelm Gustloff, a vast steel sepulchre still holding the remains of thousands. In the Tablas Strait, the charred skeletons of a ferry and a tanker have become an ossuary of twisted metal, a grim sanctuary for coral and fish. Beneath a quiet field in Arkansas, where the Mississippi has long since changed its course, the wooden bones of the Sultana slowly rot into the soil. And under the modern waterfront of Halifax, construction crews still unearth shards of the Mont Blanc. These sites are not mere wreckage. They are scars etched upon the surface of the earth. We must remember them, not to cultivate a fear of the sea, but to confront a more unsettling truth. The most destructive, most terrifying force on this planet is not the wind, nor the water, nor the fire. It is us. The most terrifying force of nature is not wind or water. It is human indifference. It is greed, pride, and the cold calculus of war. The sinking of the Titanic has been etched into our memory as a singular tragedy, a fatal confluence of circumstance and error. But its legend eclipses far greater catastrophes, born not of accident, but of the system itself. Tragedies deliberately crafted by human hands. The Wilhelm Gustloff, the Deadlier Pass, the Mont Blanc, the Sultana. These were not mere accidents, they were consequences. So the next time you step aboard a ship and glance at a life jacket or an evacuation plan, understand its true origin. It is not there simply because of the Titanic. It is there for the 9,000 souls lost in the Baltic Sea. It is there for the 4,000 who perished in the Philippines, the 2,000 who vanished in the Halifax explosion, and the nearly 2,000 scalded to death on the Mississippi. They were denied that jacket, and with it, any chance of survival. History is not written in ink. It is a chronicle penned in salt water, oil, and blood. Some of its pages remain stuck together, sealed by the dampness of oblivion. Our duty is to pry them open, to read their warnings aloud. Because the dead are silent, we must be their voice.